What's up, everybody? Oh, I gotta take the helmet off. Hi, I am Chris Carpenter, your instructor. The reason I'm dressed like this is I'm very excited. I joined Match.com and I have a date tonight with somebody I met online. I'm really excited. Her name's Medea and she seems like a great catch. She says there's been a little bit of drama with some exes, but I mean, who doesn't have that really? She says she's ambitious. I really like the fact she says she doesn't take nothing off of nobody. So I'm pretty excited about that. Well, anyway, I am your instructor, and I know that it's a beating when instructors get too excited about things and dress up in outfits and all that. But I do have sort of a reason to do it for this course and this lecture about Medea and the Greek civilization that spawned that play. One is, where else am I going to wear this fab outfit? Okay, Halloween only comes once a year. The other thing is that history plays an incredibly important role in our course and in our readings. And I'm actually going to put down my stuff here. By the way, let me talk about my stuff very quickly. This is a Corinthian helmet named for the city-state, the Greek city-state of Corinth, which is where Medea takes place. And we got the horsehair crest so that my men can find me in battle. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, lots of protection for the face. This is it's kind of a cheap knockoff, but it's supposed to be a hoplon, a infantryman's shield. This is the symbol of Argos, the city-state. It doesn't appear in Medea, but it was one of them. So I'm going to put this stuff down now because it's really uncomfortable. Anyway, I'm coming back, I promise. Okay, so, and then the rest of my get up here, this is a cuirass. It's your torso protection, linothorax armor. It's actually, this is a leather reproduction, but made them out of reinforced linen, stronger than you'd think. Got the greaves, you know, protect the shins. Got I guess this is a clave is what they call this. But anyway, point is, here we go. Let's talk about classical Greece. And in doing so, I'll use that as an intro to explain why I bothered to dress up like this and this kind of stuff. Understanding an historically important text is impossible without context. We get context from learning about, I'm going to straighten up my sleeve. I can see myself in my phone. It's very disturbing. Groovy. So we have to learn about the historical period to understand why that piece was written or written in the way it was, understand the motivations of the characters and all that. That's what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to talk so much about Medea in this lecture because you guys are going to read it. You guys are going to talk about it on the boards and think about it yourselves. So I don't need to do that, but I want to give you some historical background. And let me also use this opportunity to tell you kind of my philosophy about teaching literature, which is, oh, by the way, the owl up there, that is Athens' mascot. I'm just letting you know. Anywho, the thing is that in teaching literature, I don't view it as my job to tell you what it means because that's just my impression of it, right? And you're going to have your impression of it. And, you know, I'm not saying that all impressions or opinions are correct or they're all equally valid, but at the same time, if you suggest to me or to a classmate, you know, this is the feeling I got from this is what I think this is supposed to mean, I'm not really in a position to tell you, no, you shouldn't have thought that. All of these years of being you have led you to that conclusion and you're wrong, right? That just doesn't really make sense. So my goal is to kind of guide you. And sure, I may explain my beliefs or help you to explain yours or what have you. The point is, it's you. You're the one that reacts to the literature. You're the one that decides ultimately what it means and what you can gain from it. And that's the whole point of literature, to connect us all, to gain from other people's experiences, even if it seems initially like we have nothing in common with them, because we do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about classical Greece. Classical Greece is a specific time period. It's not just a vague adjective. It was classical. We're talking about from the 6th to the 4th century BC. And Greece was not Greece. It was a region, but it wasn't a country. And so people who lived in Athens, people who lived in Sparta, people who lived in Corinth, Argos, Thebes, they did not call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Athenians or Spartans or whatever the case may have been. These city-states were like independent countries. And most of you have probably heard, I mean, I imagine most of you have heard of Athens. I mean, Athens, pretty important. But a lot of you probably heard of Sparta because of the movie 300, which was, as I'm sure you know, was based on a graphic novel. I'm not going to go on something about historical accuracy here, but I do want to say that if we're talking about classical Greece, since most people, all they know is Sparta from that movie, we really should consider Athens as probably the most important of these city-states. Athens is where Euripides is from. And I hope this isn't confusing, but Euripides is from Athens. He's an Athenian. He's writing a play that's set in Corinth, which is a different city-state. And he's doing that, I think, because it could be dangerous at times for these playwrights to straight up write about their own city and criticize things that are going on in their own city that could cause problems. Sometimes they did it anyway. And Euripides was actually fairly brave about that stuff, but all I'm trying to do is explain that Euripides is Athenian. So if we're talking about Medea, even though it's set in another city-state, not Athens, it was written by an Athenian. And so I think really we're kind of dealing with Athens when we talk about that play. Okay, so one of the notions of Greek drama is, I will continue to adjust my shirt, so I hope that isn't too distracting. I've just got to be symmetrical. Anyway, one of the things about Greek culture and Greek art, war plays an omnipresent role. It's constantly important. I'm not going to say there was no idea of such thing as an idea of peace. There was. It was something you said you wanted, but Greek city-states really couldn't exist in a condition of peace. Partially that was because of political reasons, and they didn't like each other very much for territorial and macho reasons and all that. But partially because it was so important, war was so important as a way for a man to demonstrate that he belonged in that society. I'm not making a pro-war argument. I'm simply saying that's how those societies worked. And that includes Athens. We think of Sparta as a particularly warlike city-state, but all of them were. All right, so my point is that peace and war were sort of inseparable. You really didn't have one without the other. So even though Medea doesn't take place in a time of war and there's not a lot of battle scenes and all that, remember that Jason's adventure, Medea's awesome husband, his adventure has just ended, and so they have moved to Corinth to live a life of secluded peace, except it doesn't work out. Okay, let's talk for a moment about Athens, where Euripides is from. And the main thing to say about Athens is that it was a democracy. Now we need to, and you may know this already, but Athenian democracy is not the same as American democracy, or French democracy, or German democracy, or anything like that. It was a completely different situation. For one thing, it wasn't one person, one vote. You only had about 20% of the population that could vote. Those would be males who had gone through military training. So we can call Athens a democracy, but ain't no women voting. Nobody who didn't own land, they didn't vote. So it wasn't a true democracy, but it was unusual enough to really threaten the other Greek city-states, especially our ab-crunching friends, the Spartans, who, that was a straight military dictatorship. I mean, it was a monarchy, but it was a military government. And so they found the idea of people voting to be very threatening, as did many of the other city-states. So Athens was always, even though now Westerners take democracy for granted, that's just the way things are supposed to be. You live in a democracy. But the fact is that at the time, democracy was this really strange, very dangerous, very exotic system that many of the Greek city-states thought needed to be destroyed. It was just too unstable. That's how they viewed it. And Sparta, of course, was going to be Athens' main enemy about that stuff. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about Athens and how it worked. We know it was what we might call a partial democracy. And you would have assemblies 1 to 3 times a month of all the voters. Now you're talking probably about 6,000 people. packed into these huge, sometimes an amphitheater, but sometimes just fields on the edge of the city to vote. And they would vote, they would count votes by sight. It was pretty chaotic, and it was why the power of delivering an effective speech, or the ability to deliver an effective speech, was so important to the Athenians, because that's how you obviously swayed the majority of the voters to your side. And so Athens didn't have political parties. They didn't have interest groups like we have now. It was a matter of how well can you speak. And you'd have factions develop supporting one leader or another, but they didn't have parties per se. Okay, so I think that's enough background right now on Athens and democracy and all that kind of thing. Let's talk a minute about Euripides himself, our playwright. 480 to 406, now we're counting backward because it's BC, before the Common Era. And Euripides was, as the PowerPoint will explain, known for his comedy, but mainly known as a tragedian, okay, someone who writes tragedies. I'm not going to say we misuse the term tragedy all the time. It's just that we now have a different meaning for it than the traditional definition of a tragedy in terms of literature, okay? So for instance, let's say that, I don't want to make up something too horrible, but let's say there's a car accident and some people's lives are lost. We will call that a tragedy. In the Greek sense, or in this sense, that is not a tragedy. It's a very unfortunate, sorrowful event. But a tragedy, in literary terms, a tragedy means that people behave, they cannot escape their fate. They have character flaws, and their fate is determined by them no matter what they do. Now, I guess if we're talking about that car accident, we could come up with a scenario where somebody had a certain habit, I don't know, alcoholic or something, and that got them into the accident. But I think you understand what I'm trying to say. In literary terms, tragedy isn't just something bad. It's a specific type of something bad. It means that a human being cannot leave behind his or her flaws. No matter how even aware of them, how self-aware they are, they can't escape those flaws. It's kind of humanity's curse to have these flaws and to be unable to escape them. Ultimately, what a tragedy is after is a feeling of catharsis, C-A-T-H-A-R-S-I-S. That's a, what is that? That's a feeling of release that you experience as you're watching one of these plays, or I guess reading them, where you reach that tragic moment, and it's, even though you experience that sorrow or that loss, you're also, A, kind of glad it's not you, and B, you, for a moment, are able to understand we do have these flaws, we do need to work on them. But that's what the term tragedy means, and tragedies are what Euripides was best known for, and there's no doubt that Medea is a tragedy. Okay, let's talk for a minute about about Greek theater. You will see in the PowerPoint, and I'm sure you've seen elsewhere, Greek amphitheaters. Many have been restored. They still perform plays in several of them, even though they're thousands of years old. And of course, they recreate them, reproduce them all the time. A pretty efficient means of seating, and a pretty efficient design for voice projection. Keep in mind, you know, no loudspeakers, no amp system, no nothing like that. So actors had to be very loud. Actors also were all male, even ones playing female parts. Few exceptions to that, but generally all male. So one solution to that, aside from makeup and things like that, were masks. And you may be familiar with the famous, you know, the smiley mask and the frowny mask used to denote drama plays. The Greeks sort of pioneered that. And so playwrights were hugely famous in most of the city-states, but especially Athens. In Athens, verbal skills were paramount. They were much more important than your skill in war. They were much more, I'll say they were even more important than how much money you had or how big your estate was. If you were an extremely skilled speaker in Athens, you had the prospect of being very powerful and influential indeed. In the other city-states, not so much. So the point is, Athenians wanted to see these plays. So twice a year there was a huge competition, a playwriting competition. Euripides would enter year after year, as would his fellow Athenian opponents. There's Aristophanes, Sophocles. So these are huge names even now that are competing with one another in these playwriting competitions. All I'm trying to say is it's a very important art form in Athens. Now, not many people go to plays. Theater certainly is practiced. It has fans. People know about it, but it doesn't play nearly the same cultural role, which makes sense because we've got so many other options now, and at the time they did not. Anyway, okay. So talk a little bit more about the theater. In order to perform one of your plays, you needed patrons. Now, a patron, I think this is in the PowerPoint as well, is someone wealthy who can pay for your play to be put on, because as a playwright, I mean, you could do pretty well for yourself, but yeah, you probably, at least starting out, you weren't terribly wealthy, so you needed these patrons. You also needed influential and wealthy patrons to be behind you politically in case you PO'd someone or upset someone that was very powerful. So patronage was important, and Euripides was in search of patrons for most of his career, just like the other playwrights. Euripides also was pretty well known. I said earlier that he set Medea probably in Corinth because he wanted to be careful, but Euripides also was known for being pretty fearless about who he criticized in his plays. It wasn't uncommon during an Athenian play, a performance of an Athenian play, for someone in the audience to be called out, to be insulted or made fun of or to be criticized. And of course, that was an effective means of criticism, but it could also, the cost could be pretty high if you upset the wrong person. So Euripides was known for being fairly fearless about that kind of thing, but he too needed patrons. Let's talk a moment about the chorus in a Greek play. That's 12 to 15 people. In the case of Medea, they're supposed to be women. Now, they're going to be males playing women, but they are supposed to be women. They're supposed to be the women of Corinth who are viewing this train wreck and who are making comments as the events transpire. Choruses were really interesting. They were an important innovation in theater because it allowed there to be a voice of the audience. It allowed the audience to identify with someone on stage. Now, maybe the audience already did identify with some of the characters, but the point of the chorus is to be the everyman or the everywoman, making a commentary on what's happening. But the thing is, the chorus could be wrong, just like the guy in the street can be wrong. He or she may rush to judgment, may assume information they don't know. They may not really know the story behind a breaking news item, but they're going to go ahead and give their opinion anyway. And the choruses would do that sometimes. I think that's kind of cool because, that was deliberate. So the chorus sometimes is deliberately written to be kind of ignorant, just like an uninformed audience member might be. But the point is that a chorus allowed an audience to identify with something that was going on stage, and that would possibly involve them to a greater degree. Okay, let's talk for a minute about, we'll talk about the Greek gods, and then we'll finish up with just a little bit about the Peloponnesian War, and then you'll be free of this terrible charade. Okay, so let's talk about the pantheon of Greek gods. The term we use to describe the Greek cosmology, right? The Greek worship system is polytheistic. Polytheistic. That means that there are numerous gods, not just one. Monotheistic religions are Christianity, Islam. They predominate today. In the past, that generally wasn't the case. You would have polytheistic systems. The Greek was certainly one of those. So that's one difference between then and now. Another major difference is the gods themselves. Not just who they were or their names, but what they were like. Because in monotheistic systems like we have now, generally speaking, gods are beyond reproach. You know, there is one God and God is perfect, right? In a polytheistic system, that's not going to be the case, and particularly in the Greek, and you're going to read the Aeneid in a couple of weeks, the Roman epic, same thing there. These gods are not perfect. After all, man was sort of created in their image, and so therefore, these gods they can be jealous, they can be petty, they can be lustful, they can be angry, they can be prejudiced. I mean, all of the stuff that we're burdened with as humans, these tragic flaws, or just basic flaws, the gods have them too. And unfortunately, the gods are powerful enough. Now, there is a hierarchy of Greek gods, and Zeus is at the top, but they're all powerful. And they're all powerful enough to mess with humans' plans. So it is routine to see in Greek plays the gods intervene. They decide they don't like the way something is going, so I'm just going to change that. In the myth, Jason's pursuit of the golden fleece, Medea's husband, in the adventure that happens to him before he and Medea, before this play takes place, the gods intervene repeatedly, both for him and against him. So you get my point. It's a polytheistic system, and the gods are flawed. They do have human characteristics, and we see that all the time in this art. Okay, so to kind of the thesis sense of all that is, godlike does not necessarily mean morally perfect. Not in the Greek system. Okay, on we go. I want to talk just a little bit about the Peloponnesian War, not because I'm going to, there may be a quiz question on it, on this lecture, but beyond that, I don't think you need to know a whole lot about it. It's a super confusing war if you really get into it, but we're not going to really get into it. It is essentially, so it rages from 431 to 404 BC, okay? And it essentially is Athens versus Sparta. And there's debate even today about who actually started it. But the bottom line was Sparta was very threatened by Athens' system of democracy. And I don't want to paint Athens as an innocent victim of aggression, because Athens was very aggressive itself in trying to export democracy, in trying to create other democracies in Greece and around the Mediterranean. And of course, a lot of governments did not appreciate that. So that the war was really between Sparta and Athens. If you saw 300, in that movie, the Spartans and Athenians are allied against the Persians. Peloponnesian War, the Persians don't play much of a role. They're kind of behind the scenes. But bottom line is, it's Athens versus Sparta. Why does this matter? Well, for one thing, Medea, the play, debuts right as this war is beginning. And so I'm interested to see if you, without being experts on Greek political or military history or any of that, I'm just curious to see if you guys think you see anything in Medea that might be an implicit criticism or statement. Maybe not, but it's possible that you might. All right, so anyway, this war drags on and on and on. And Athens, very roughly, we can say Athens dominates the first part of it because they have a great navy, and then Sparta dominates the second part of it, even though Sparta's infantry, its foot soldiers, are so famous or well known, but Sparta eventually develops a navy too, and Sparta wins the war. That's eventually what happens. Now, the thing is, though, and I feel compelled to say this, I know 300's now, what is it? It's almost 10 years old. I mean, it's been out for quite a while now. But for so long, everybody was really jazzed about Sparta. And I just want, just for the sake of someone saying it, if you're comparing Athens and Sparta, without any offense meant to anyone who lives in, say, Euless, you're talking about New York City versus Euless in terms of culture. Sparta had a great army, great. But name me one Spartan playwright, Spartan philosopher, Spartan poet, Spartan artist, on and on it goes. So Sparta was an army, and that's great, and that's cool, but even though Sparta won that war, we shouldn't really forget that, number one, Athens eventually came back just as powerfully as they'd been before. And number two, Athens wound up inspiring Western civilization. I mean, Athens is really kind of the birthplace of so many notions of not just democracy, but art, and art's role in society. A lot of those things, I'm not saying that the Athenians invented art or anything. I'm just saying that they set a precedent that we really still follow today. All right. So anyway, that war, Athens versus Sparta, Sparta eventually wins. But Medea debuts right at the beginning of that war. Okay, now eventually what happens to the Greeks, the city-states, is they fight each other, they fight each other, they fight each other, and then Philip II of Macedon, whose son you may know, Alexander the Great, Philip II comes in and conquers Greece, and from that point on, Greece is ruled by Macedon and then by Rome. And so when we talk about classical Greece, where this play premiered, that was Greece's day in the sun. That 200 years, that 6th to 4th century BC, really was the apex of Greek culture. And that's why Medea and other works like it are so important. They represent really the apex of that culture. Its creativity, its insight, its criticism into human behavior and observation of human behavior. Okay, I'm going to finish, I promise, one last thing. This is about Jason. I want to talk about Jason for just a minute. Because when people read Medea, obviously they're not always terribly sympathetic to her, especially considering how the play ends. I won't spoil it, but you're going to know, if you don't already, pretty soon how it ends. And they can't possibly feel... They claim that they can't possibly feel any sympathy for Medea because of what she does, and that makes sense. But the reason Medea does what she does, or part of the reason, it could be she's just crazy, but it also could be that Jason, the great hero Jason, Jason in the Argonauts, Jason who went after and captured the Golden Fleece, she saved his life over and over and over and over and over and over and over again during that adventure, and received not much credit for it. And then he bails on her and picks up some young thing. So, I'm not saying that justifies anything that she does, but if we know a little bit about Jason's adventure, then maybe it will help us put Medea's actions into context. Now, your text talks about that a little bit, goes through Jason's adventure briefly, but the story itself, Jason's pursuit of the Golden Fleece, is estimated to have taken place about 1300 BC, so long time before Medea was written. So even when Medea is written, this is ancient. It's a myth, but it's viewed as ancient history. So one thing I want to throw out there is I'm interested to see what you think about Jason's role in Medea, and why Euripides chose to focus on, how do I put this? Medea is the main character, but Jason, who's supposed to be this awesome Greek hero, he's so brave and he's so resourceful and he's so smart. And Jason, when you read his myth, his success is based way more on this than on this. He's strong and he can fight and all that, but he outthinks his problems. Unlike, say, Hercules, who just smashes everything up. Hercules, by the way, on Jason's ship, the Argo. Well, anyway, so Jason is viewed as such an innovator and such a thinker. I wonder why it is that Euripides puts him in a position where he can be criticized. A lot of people don't. They think no matter what Jason did, it didn't justify what happened. But, Jason bears some responsibility, right, for what happens. I'm interested to see what you think about that on the boards. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm interested to see, why we think that Euripides used Jason in that role to kind of set him up. Do you think Jason represents something political, or do you think he represents something social? Do you think it's a gender criticism? Okay, well, I'm not going to rehash the whole Jason adventure. In fact, I'm going to wrap up now. as you thank Zeus. But I just want to point out that, you know, remember that Medea is responsible for Jason's life being saved many, many times over, and she has, to some extent, magical powers. I mean, she's not a goddess herself, but she is kind of a spellcaster, you know. She knows poisons, she knows magic, and it's one of those things where if you're going to wind up with this person, maybe you ought to think about that skill set and how it might wind up coming back on you if you do her wrong. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. But one thing that I find, I'll promise this is my last note, what I find fascinating about Medea is it is so taken for granted that there is this woman scorned bit where, you know, men are really violent and all that, but man, you get a woman really into a corner and you don't know what she'll do. I mean, we all probably have different opinions about that, but I think it's interesting that that's such a persistent cliche that, you know, women are fine until you betray them and then they're worse than 15 hells put together. And you know, I really am not trying to be politically correct here. It's just that when you numerically compare acts of violence, I mean, it's not even close. It's not even close. So even though there are shows like, say, Snapped, which on Oxygen about women who kill, what kind of a moron would, you know, watch that, or I don't know, own DVDs of it? But anyway, the point is, this is a very persistent cliche. So what about Medea? Is she supposed to be just a particularly wheels-off person, regardless of whether she's a woman? Or do you think Euripides is trying to make a statement about women? Or do you think he's trying to make a statement about women being forced into certain behavior? I mean, I'm open to any of it, and I'm really fascinated to see what you think. Medea is an endlessly fascinating play to me. Hopefully it'll resonate in some way with you. So, at long last, I am done. I thank you for your time, and I will see you soon. All right, thank you.